Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate and it is the 2024 book wrap-up video. I've not collected all the books that I have read this year to show you. I will put pictures of the titles or what the books look like in the corner. More editing for me in the long run, but also having just revamped my bookshelves and made them look pretty and put everything in place, I am reluctant to pull books out of my bookshelf. So we are just going to talk about the books that I've read this year. We're going to speed through this because it can end up being a really, really long video. And I think I'm also recording this a little bit prematurely. It is the 23rd of December. And so we still have a couple of days until the end of 2024. Will be books that I will still read before the end of the year, but I won't get a chance to talk about them. I am obviously filming this ahead of time. I will mention those books maybe in post-production editing, or I'll put them all in the description box below, all of the books that I have read for 2024. But as of today, as of Monday, 23 December, I have read 47 books. This also doesn't include any of my graphic novels that I've read. If I were to include those, it will be 52 books in totality. So, but I'm not including those at this point. These are I'm just including books that I have read this year. I'm just looking at my story graph at the moment. It has been an interesting reading year. I will be doing a separate video on like my favorite books, so do keep a lookout for that. But let's talk about the books that I have read this year. Some of them you wouldn't have heard me talk about before, but let's talk about it. Okay. So the first book that I read is The Hyacinth Girl, T.S. Eliot's Hidden Muse by Lyndall Gordon. This book for me was just incredible. I really had such an insightful view into the Emily Hale letters that were released a couple of years ago. I have a video on that. I will link it in the description box below. It's a private video, but if you have the link, you can watch it. And this was just a fascinating insight by a wonderful, wonderful author, Lyndall Gordon. I actually managed to meet her this year at the Elliot conference, and incredible. Her and I actually went to the same university. Just saying. So really loved this book. Would I probably reread it again? Not in its entirety, but there are pieces in there that I've bookmarked and that I will come back to, especially because I have an idea for a paper that I want to write in the new year, which will incorporate this significantly. The next book is Woman in the Picture by Catherine McCormack. I've talked about this enough on my channel. Incredible nonfiction book about viewing art and art history, and has been foundational in establishing the view that I want to take for my dissertation. Next book is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. I'm going to maybe get this wrong, either the 2023 or 2024, maybe 2023 actually, if I remember correctly, 2023 Booker Prize winner. This book was okay for me. I liked it in parts, I didn't like it in others. Having just finished Prophet Song, which I'll talk about in a bit, I think Prophet Song should have won. Would I reread it again? No. Will I still keep it on my bookshelves? Yes, because I feel like this is a book that you would have a different perspective on depending on when you read it in your life. And I think at the time that I read this book, I was just maybe too young to read it, even though it was only a year ago. I think it appeals to a different audience in a way, but it is a fascinating book, and I think it's really brilliant to show the impact of choices on ordinary people and everyday lives. The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. I loved this book. absolutely loved it. I did listen to it as well as an audiobook, and I think the audiobook really brought it to life. So this was one of my big reads of 2024. I think I finished it much quicker than I anticipated. Really loved it. Would read it again, and I would love to. The only thing that I regret about this is that I did not understand sort of the astrological elements that encapsulate this work, and I would love to have understood that maybe before reading it. But not to say that I wouldn't, explore that again and then reread it again. The next book is The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. I cried so hard in this book. It's a beautiful story. I think it's really, really incredible. It's really impactful. I felt very akin to it. I read it while I was in Oxford, and it's set in Oxford, and I think there was a huge amount of familiarity while I was reading it. This sort of personal sense of it really stuck with me, and as I say, I cried like a baby during this book. I think that was a interesting reaction for me. I often don't just, well, I do cry often, but it has to take a lot for me to cry in a book, and I cried 3 times in this book. I think that probably says a fair bit of it, but I enjoyed this book hugely. I am determined to read the other one that she has, which is the Bookbinders of Jericho, I believe. I would love to get hold of it. It's a lighter kind of read. It's easy to get into. It's easy to read. It's easy to fall in love with the characters. It's not a particularly difficult read, but it is an emotional read, and I think for that reason it came to me at the right time, and I just loved it. After much duress, I suppose, from friends, I read Fourth Wing, the first installment by Rebecca Yarros, and it was fun. It was interesting. It was different. I really liked the Gaelic names of the dragons. I thought that was pretty cool. Not something I would lose my mind over, especially because I kind of called the ending. I'm really annoying like that, is that I can kind of pick up what the plot is pretty quickly. But it was a nice break from some heavy reads, and I know I should read the second one before the third one comes out, or the third one's already come out, or something like that. I can't remember exactly, so I know I should read the second one. Maybe I'll do it in 2025. I'll see. Maybe it might be one of my light reads of 2025. I then also read A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett and Clair. This is a romance book that is a retelling of Hades and Persephone. Persephone's story in mythology is one of my favorites, and I find it really fascinating, and so I thought I'd give this a try. Will I read the rest of the series? Absolutely not. Was it a fun read? Yes, it was. That's all I have to say. There was not much more to it. I think I read it in a day. It wasn't particularly wow. I then read 2 books together. I read After Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz, and Sapo's poems, that fragmented poems. And this was a really incredible experience. After Sappho, I know, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in one of the years, and I can totally understand why, because the fragments of impact on women throughout history was mirrored from Sappho's poems into the novel After Sappho itself, and it hits those meanings where it's an image of the form, but also the impact of the poetry years later. And so I think reading the 2 together was really fantastic, because as they were referring to a fragment in a poem, or fragment or a poem in the book, I was then able to look it up in the poetry collection. And I think this enhanced the reading of it so, so much. And it's definitely the way I would recommend reading this book. Were I to read it in isolation, I actually think I would struggle with this book. It doesn't have sort of a defined plot line. Its characters are varied. There's bits and pieces that go on randomly, and then there's characters that jump back in the end, and it is fragmented. It's supposed to be fragmented, but I think it's probably a book that were I not conducting this sort of dual reading experiment, it's not something that I actually would have enjoyed in isolation. Then I read Paradais by Fernanda Melchor, and short little book, really engaging writing and really interesting. I thought it was well done. I think it was definitely a book that hits off the back as a dark book. There is clearly something sinister in the air as soon as you open this book, but it is brilliantly written, very, very atmospheric, and an incredible literary fiction book that I think kind of hits in the same way as like Claire Keegan does, where it's things are happening on the peripheral that are really, really important, but the characters get looped into this sort of isolating scenario. And it's very, very fascinating to see that develop. The next book that I read was Where I End by Sophie White. This is an incredible book published by Tram Press here in Ireland. Oh, this book gave me the creeps. But that's what it was meant to do. It was so incredible. The experience of reading this book was just fascinating. I loved every single second that my skin crawled in this book. It's kind of horror-esque, kind of not. It's more sort of uncanny, more gothic-y, more just unsettling as a book rather than horror, but there are horror-filled elements to it and some elements that will definitely make your skin crawl. And I think this book is absolutely fantastic, and I will recommend it to any reader that loves Stephen King or Shirley Jackson. It kind of gave me similar vibes to We've Always Lived in the Castle, which I know was a big influence on Sophie White's writing. So it did give me those kind of vibes, but the way she encapsulates it in an Irish story is just fabulous. Totally recommend. Would I reread it? I don't know. I feel like I really want to, and yet at the same time I don't want to like submit myself to that creepiness again. So I don't know. We'll have to see. All right. Keeping going on Tram Press, I then got an advance copy of Old Romantics by Maggie Armstrong. This book is brilliant, and I think it would hit home a lot more for women who are mothers. There are parts of it about motherhood and about transitioning from being a single woman with autonomy to becoming a mother that is dependent, where a child is dependent on you. And I think it's quite raw in that emotional investigation of motherhood. And I think for some women, there's a sense of shame when it comes to those feelings of losing your identity in motherhood. And I think Armstrong really hits these notes very, very well in a way that kind of makes you feel, empathetic and associated with what is being put on the page, but also the turmoil that comes with it. And so I really loved this. I loved the opportunity to read this and to engage with it. As I say, I think it would have hit true, or it would have hit harder were I a mother, but I still think reading it, there are aspects of it, especially in the beginning, where I found myself relating to what she is putting on the page and those sort of dark, tumultuous thoughts that come through. Part of my master's curriculum was to read Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, and this book destroyed me. It broke my heart. Hardy does break your heart though, and I've spoken about this in a previous video, but I loved this book. I will definitely reread. Hi Millie. I will definitely reread it, and I look forward to rereading it now that I know what happens. Typical Hardy, typical heartbreak. Absolutely loved it. Won't say any more about it. I then finally got round to reading Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? And this book was also just so brilliant. For me, it's not about the romance in Rooney. It's about the philosophical explorations that she takes us down. And for me, particularly in Beautiful World, Where Are You? Was the representation of female friendship. This just hit so true to me, and I loved seeing the development of the friendship between Alison and Eileen, and I thought that this was a triumph, and I'm so glad that I finally got around to reading it and absolutely loving it. Will definitely reread. I am a Rooney fan. I know some people aren't. That's absolutely fine. I get why not. And, won't fight about it on the internet, but I do think that there's something truly spectacular in her writing. And were I to write a book, I would want to write it in a similar vein to the way Sally Rooney is written. Then in a short drive home from a holiday, I listened to Claire Keegan's Foster. Perfection. Claire Keegan can do no wrong in my eyes. I just love the way that she incorporates, I mentioned this earlier, but I love the way that she incorporates significant historical events on the peripheral. And I recently read an interview with her where she was talking about small things like these in the film that came out recently, and the power that she talks about, the power of restraint in her writing. And I think that's so powerful. The power of restraint in her writing. It would be so easy for her to create this melodramatic space in which these characters exist, particularly given the circumstances on which she's writing. And yet she pulls herself back. I can see her sitting there physically restraining herself while she is writing and refocusing herself on the inner story and the characters and the effects that it has on normal people. And yet the impact is there, the drive is there. It's the physical presence that comes forth in her writing without overtaking it. And I just think it is so fantastic. Then a non-fiction read, I read New Worlds, Last Worlds, The Rule of the Tudors by Suzanne Brigden. This was a great it's not little, it was a great introduction into the Tudors and the rule of the Tudors and the historical context surrounding it. But what I really loved about this particular edition is its focus on Ireland. So if you are looking for a Tudor introduction that's really comprehensive and that hits all the major points, but also includes the impact of the Tudors on Ireland, which has sorely been neglected in some of the other books, I would definitely recommend picking this up. I think it's a really fabulous introduction and something that was super duper helpful to me going into my early modern seminars. I then read Marjan Mon Amour by Katja Oskab. This was, I believe, the Dublin Literary Prize winner for 2023. That's right. This is a really intriguing book. It's kind of self-fictionalized by the author, by Katja. It's translated from German, and it's not a very big book, but it's essentially just about the narrator's interactions with the clients that she deals with at her salon. And I found the beauty in the mundane of this book. I found it really engaging, really interesting to read. And I really loved the ending of this book. I thought it came beautifully full circle. And there was just so much to engage with in this book. I can totally see why it won the award, especially because I read other shortlists from that year. There was something missing for me, and I don't know if it's because I'm such a huge fan of like the idea of history existing on the peripheral. There were some nudges at this when the narrator was talking about her clients and their experiences and their circumstances. It was hinted at the impact of the division between East and West Berlin. That was in there, but it wasn't really in there. And yet I felt like I didn't quite get the same impactful feeling that I get from a book like Claire Keegan's, for instance. But I think that's what Oskap was going for. And I know this year she's released a second novel, which I got sent and which I would love to, maybe I should try read it before the end of the year, but just really, really brilliant. And I totally understand why this book won. I then read Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr., which I really felt engaged in this book. It is so fascinating. It's about two sisters and the different impacts of their lives based on the choice of one singular event that happened in their childhood. And I don't want to give too much away because I think the plot of this is quite simple, but the atmosphere, the writing, the feeling that comes from this book, I honestly felt like I was in the dirt working with these women. It was so, so profound and so beautiful to experience. And yet I know that this book was it shortlisted for the International Booker this year? I believe it was shortlisted. It didn't win, but it was shortlisted, and I get that. I think it's a really brilliant book. It's the first time I've read a Brazilian author. I believe, I could be wrong on that, but it was so engaging to see this side of history that I hadn't seen, and I absolutely loved it, and I will read any other work that comes from this author. Next book is Le Door by Mary Shelley. Lesser known work of Mary Shelley, and I found it really, really interesting. I don't know whether it was a blurb on this book or a review that I read, but it was basically Shelley's take on an Austen novel. And I think that's actually it's a really appropriate description for this book. It's kind of got your typical family structure, your typical family drama that comes with marriage and money and estates and things like that. But it hits a bit further, I think, than your typical Austen reach, where it talks about travel, it talks about independent women, it talks about a whole range of things that are maybe subjects from that would be a bit too dark, I think, for Austen to tackle. And yet I found myself really engaged with this. I found myself really loving the writing, really loving the storyline. It is a plot-driven book, and a character-driven book. I found myself really loving the ending, especially the reconciliation between two characters. I don't want to give it away, but there was something that came out of this that really struck me, and that is, I think, interesting from Shelley. And I'd be interested to kind of trace when she wrote this and what she was reading and what she was thinking and all this side of thing. But the main character that it follows, which is the daughter of Lyndall, actually is probably the most one-dimensional character of this entire book, whereas everyone else has development in some way, shape, and form. And for me, that's interesting, is that's very Dickensian, I find, which is again a different turn, is that the main character is more just the driver of the story rather than actually the beauty that is held in it. So, and you know, she is your typical virtuous woman in society. And so I thought that was a particularly interesting choice for Shelley. I'd love to understand a bit more why, and I'd love to see what the impact of that was for her. I'd love to know a bit more about when she was writing Lyndall and what her thought process was around that, because I think it's interesting choice for Shelley. I then read the second installment of the All Souls trilogy or collection, I don't know what it's called, Shadow of Night by Deborah Harkness. Deborah Harkness is a brilliant historical fiction writer, and I think she includes the fantasy elements incredibly well. I really loved A Discovery of Witches because of that. I loved the research that she put into formulating the setting in which her characters exist, and I think that's the richness for me. There were 2 points of this book that I really didn't like. The first was her description or her characterization of Christopher Marlowe. I love Christopher Marlowe. I've always been a fan of his writing. I think his writing has a level of sophistication that in some places beats William Shakespeare's writing. My own personal opinion, don't come for me in the comments. But I did not, I hated the way that Harkness characterized Marlowe, because I don't think he is that character. I do not think he was like that. And so that really bothered me, especially because he plays such an important role in the book. Secondly, I did not like the reliance on pregnancy in this novel for, you know, the importance of a woman to be pregnant for the plot to go forward. Just bugged me so severely. I understand why they did it. I understand why it's important for the development of the story. I can see what's going to happen in the next book. Harkness lost me a little bit on this one, I have to admit. I was so looking forward to it because the early modern period in which this is set is my area of expertise, and I loved the inclusion of characters like the Countess of Pembroke. But I don't know, there was those 2 aspects that just grated me, and so for that reason I wasn't that big of a fan of this second book. Kind of continuing on disappointment reads, I got so excited to read Cities of Smoke and Starlight by Ali Ernest, and big disappointment. Didn't like the banter between the 2 main characters, even though I think it was the whole primary purpose of it. This book is definitely aimed as a young adult read, but even so, when they say that there is no spice in this book for a romance novel, there is nothing. Not even an accidental touch. There's nothing. And for me, I found that disappointing and lacking. It doesn't have to be super duper spicy. It doesn't have to be anything like that. But actually, it just came down to the end of the book where I was like, these characters don't actually like each other. They've just been thrown into these circumstances and they really just have no other choice. So I was disappointed. I think the premise was really good. I actually enjoyed the world building a little bit. I think it was maybe overdone in some points, but it actually didn't hit the right points for me. And so I will not be continuing reading the series. Next was Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. This book was such a breath of fresh air for me. What a gorgeous little novel. I loved every second of it. I thought it was so cute. I thought the story was brilliant. I loved every second of it. It's so wholesome, so cute, so lovely, but just not something that I think most people would pick up because it kind of is genre bending, I suppose, at this point in time. Obviously, it was written at a time that was a bit different from our contemporary reading structures, and yet I think it's such a gorgeous example of how writing can uplift and make you feel so good and so happy. I loved this book so much. It would definitely be a book that I would pick up again and reread because it just has that sort of wonderful, homely, gorgeous feeling. The best way that I can describe this book is like watching The Holiday, but in, I think, like the 1920s. It's truly wonderful. Next book was M by Kim Thuy. I think this book was really fascinating. It was heartbreaking in some instances because it's one of those books where each chapter is the next person's sort of perspective. So it's a timeline, sort of chronological view of the impact of the Vietnamese War. And I think as a historical fiction, truly insightful. And I thought it was brilliantly written and truly captures the variety of consequences on multiple different circumstances and people in society. And this was the other book that was shortlisted for the Dublin Literary Awards in 2023. And I thought this book was going to win. It didn't win, but it was shortlisted. And I really enjoyed this book. I think for some people who are particularly interested in that facet of history will find it really fascinating. I also really loved the ending to this book. The sort of closing of the loop at the end was brilliant. This is already a long video. Oh, we've got so many to go. Okay. Keeping going. So Distant from My Life by Monique Libodo. Loved this book. Absolutely loved it. I thought it was so clever, so brilliant, and I was heartbroken at the end. I really enjoyed this book. I found it impactful. I found it emotional, but I think it does it in a very sort of nuanced and interesting way. And so, yes, really enjoyed. Brilliant read. Totally understand why Tilted Access would have picked it up. 100%. Also the fact that it's translated. Brilliant. I then read the Turkish embassy letters that were written by Mary Wortley Montagu during her travels in the Ottoman Empire. These letters were really fascinating. I was reading them as a part of my master's course, and I thought they were incredibly insightful as a woman's perspective on this period of history. And I referred to them a lot in one of my research papers. Thought they were fascinating. Thought it was really, really interesting to read. And yeah, I think that's about it. Would it be something to pick up? I think only if you were interested in that period of history and reading these letters. I do think they are pioneering. And I read them alongside Eve Bites Back, which is this incredible book by Anna Bear. And I love the impact that I love what Anna Bear has identified as female authorship and sort of rewritten female authorship from beginning to end. And the deep dive that she goes into some of these specific authors, including Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Again, wouldn't recommend unless it's something that you're particularly interested in reading. There are a lot of portraits of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu as well, of her in Turkish dress, which I think is a really fascinating discussion point. And so would recommend if that is something that you are interested in. Just spoke about Eve Bites Back. This is a brilliant literary revival of feminist or female authors throughout time, and really discusses the impact of authorship during the time that these women were writing. It was brilliant because it opened my eyes to some authors that I had maybe not considered in the past or hadn't heard of, which again is a show in and of itself. And I just loved Anna Bear's manner of investigative writing. And the only thing that I would say about this is that as an academic, as a literary academic, I wanted more. But I also understand why she restrained herself in this particular form. This isn't obviously a full-blown academic text. It was written for a very particular audience, but what I did appreciate was her inclusion of references and sources. I still would have wanted a bit more, though. That's my own personal thing. I then read Notes of a Native Son by James Baldwin. This is an interesting read, and I think it's very important for everyone to read something of James Baldwin's work, and I'm trying to get through as many of his texts as I can. Giovanni's Room, to this day, is one of my favorite books. And Notes of a Native Son are his reflections over time, personal reflections over time. And I think it's interesting to see his thoughts develop, but yet still maintain that foundational stance. And having listened to interviews with James Baldwin, I can just hear his voice come through in the text themselves. I think this is a great book to read. I think it's a very important book to read, and important to understanding the lived circumstances of Black Americans during the time. And yes, anything from Baldwin will get that for me. I then read Divine Rivals. This is the first, I think I don't know if there's more than 2 books that are planning on coming out for this, but Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross was wonderful. And this is exactly the kind of light romance, fantasy, young adult novel that everyone should read and use as like as a measuring post for writing this kind of book, because I loved this book. I had such a great time reading it. Loved the intricacies. I finished it and I immediately wanted to pick up the second book. I didn't. I need to now get it and read it, but I really enjoyed this. Highly recommend, especially as a light sort of palate cleanser read. This is 100% a light palate cleanser read. Recommendation from my friend Anne. Actually, I think this was a gift from her as well. The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. Such an incredible little book. obviously very atmospheric, definitely a book that you want to read in the summer. The story is very, very basic, and it's fragments of memory that come from the author herself spending time on this little island that her family used to summer in, and it was the experiences of a grandmother and a granddaughter, and their days spent summering on this island. And I think this is a book that you read and that you never really let go of, and you will maybe pick up randomly, continue to read throughout your years, pick out new things that you missed. But overall, I understand why this book has been published and republished over and over again, and why so many people are so attached to it. I know that she wrote another book. I think she's written the winter book as well, or something like that, which I'd love to maybe get hold of and read at some point. I just found this book really lovely and a great sort of thought-provoking but gentle and wonderful book to read, especially in the summer. Now to talk about Solenoid. Solenoid was the winner of the Dublin Literary Award this year. I didn't end up reading the shortlist for this year, but I went into a bookstore and perused the books that were being shortlisted, and I picked up two of them. One was Solenoid, the other was Praiseworthy. And as I started reading the first bits of these books, I could tell from the get-go that Solenoid was going to win. It's the first time any of my predictions have come true. This book is a journey. If you've read if you've read any books like Ulysses, or some of those books that are a journey, Solenoid is a journey. It doesn't really have a defined plot. It's not really cohesive. You don't really know what's going on throughout the book. The writing, the fact that it's translated, just blows my mind, because the writing is spectacular. The prose is beautiful. The words used are incredible. The description of what's going on is insane. It makes no logical sense, mind you. The whole book is bizarre. But that's the point of it, and I found it really, really fascinating. And I finished this book thinking to myself, I actually finished this book and started crying. Not because it was sad, but just because the experience of reading this book was profound. And there are very few books in the world that you would read and would affect you so much. And this is absolutely, I think the thing is that this book is not something that I would recommend to anyone. There is a particular kind of reader that will find themselves impacted by this book. And it's a slog, I have to tell you. There were times where I put this book aside for weeks and weeks on end, and I never picked it up again. But when you get back into it and you kind of get into the flow and the rhythm of this book and reading and figuring out what's going on and going back and forth, there is something truly fantastic about this book. And I 100% understand why it won. I would totally agree with that. I would totally agree that it should have won based on the shortlist selection. This is a 1 in a million book, I think. And as I say, I think it's a 1 in a million book for a particular reader. I would not recommend it to any old random person to read, because they would hate me, and that is so fair. They should hate me, because this is, again, one of those books. But I loved it. I loved it so, so much. And this will be one of my top reads for 2024. I finally then finished the Nervous Conditions trilogy. This last book, This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Ndangaremba. Nothing beats Nervous Conditions for me. Nothing beats it. But This Mournable Body was much, much better than the Book of Not, which was the second installment. But it still held itself in discomfort, which is the point of these books, is that it holds itself in the sense of discomfort. And by the end of it, you feel yourself... I felt myself so angry at the main character, at Tambudzai, and I found myself just angry at the circumstances, angry at the characters, angry at the way we have handled discrimination and race in history. Just need to soften the light. The way that we've handled these issues, and but I was sad that this trilogy is finally over. I was sad that the trilogy is finally finished. I started reading this I read Nervous Conditions in 2022. I read the Book of Not in 2023, and now I finished This Mournable Body in 2024. But for me, Nervous Conditions just hit a different note, and I still think it's the best one out of all three. Then an incredible book by a debut author, Christine Ann Foley. I read Bodies. This book was intense, but so incredible for a debut novel. Christine hit it out of the park. I just thought this book was so brilliant, so insightful. I really loved reading it. I thought that there were so many things, particularly of my youth, that I connected with, that I was it was kind of cringy, but it was also incredible to see. Oh, look at this light. And then the little twist at the end, brilliant, great read, something I think every woman in their feminine rage era should read, because it just gets you all like riled up and wanting to like rage, essentially. And yeah, just loved it. Christine, well done, phenomenal book. Would recommend to many women in my life, and have done. Then read Vette by Charlotte Bronte. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was so good. Does it hit the same as like Jane Eyre? No, it doesn't. But to some extent, I think this is a more mature novel. And so the brilliance of it is more subtle. I would love to continue to read the Bronte novels in the coming years. Let's see how we get on. But yes, loved Vette. Glad I finally read it. Would definitely reread. I thought that the character was brilliant. The ending was... oh, I just wanted that last little bit at the end. If you've read Vette, you know what I mean. But I loved this book. I loved it so much. I just wanted that last little bit of resolution at the end. But that's me just being romantic. And yeah, I thought it was great. The Prime of Just Miss Jean Brodie. What an incredible small little book. I was flabbergasted. So brilliant. The premise of this book, as you know, a teacher that looks after her sort of elite view of girls, and the driver that she had around them. I thought that this was so good. Such a nice little interlude, but also kind of one of those books where you finish it at the end and you're like, oh, that was, you know, like you have a visceral reaction to it because the twist is so intense, and you have this kind of visceral response to it, and really brilliant. But I really loved Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. Then a couple of books thrown in here for my masters, which I think I've talked about a fair bit on my channel, or I probably would want to talk about in a bit more in an upcoming sort of series that I'm planning, so I won't go into too much detail. But I read Memoirs of Emma Courtney by Mary Hayes. I read Maria by Mary Shelley and Elizabeth Ichbold. Elizabeth Ichbold's A Simple Story. Loved them all, thought they were really interesting. Maria was heart-wrenching, melodramatic and heart-wrenching, but yes, I mean, not Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft. Just, it hit true in so many other ways. I also listened and loved Waverley by Walter Scott. I wasn't anticipating loving Walter Scott, but I really enjoyed listening to Waverley. I think if I was reading it, I would really struggle with it. It was so slow to start. But once I got into it, I thought it was really great. So I enjoyed those for my masters. I then read Homegoing by Yarros. This book was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. The new chapter per generation, tracing the difference, the different impacts of two sisters, one who is a slave, who was sold into slavery, and the other who is a slave's wife. Exceptional. I loved every bit of it. And I thought the ending was perfection. Anyone who is trying to write a book, read this book and read how Ghazi ends it, because it's chef's kiss. It is quintessential. There is nothing that tops this kind of ending. Just all round well done. Got a few left. And then, I went against my rule. Usually I don't read hyped books as they, books that come out and get hypes. I don't read them. I let them sit for a while. That's why it took me so long to get to Beautiful World, Where Are You, and Fourth Wing and all this kind of stuff. But I could not help myself, and I read Intermezzo by Sally Rooney when it came out. And immediately as I started reading it, I was like, Rooney's doing her Ulysses. Like, this hit like Ulysses. This hit like a Russian novel. This hit in a different way. And I was flabbergasted by what Rooney did in taking these influences and making them her own. This novel was still very quintessentially Rooney. There was a lot of philosophical ideas that were thrown about in subtle ways, and the sort of construction of society being questioned in a number of different manners. But I was flabbergasted by this book. I want it to be my favorite Rooney. I think it is my favorite Rooney because of its association with Ulysses and the similarity in style there. Is it the one that I would probably reread over and over and over again? Probably not. I think for me, that's Beautiful World, Where Are You? But the modernist influence of Intermezzo and the skill in her writing that she took with this really hit true for me, and I'm so impressed by this book. It lived up to the hype for me. Again, I understand that Rooney is not everyone's cup of tea. I think what I am seeing with her writing as she kind of gets older, as she's producing more books, is a maturity in her writing from Conversation with Friends and Normal People to something like Intermezzo, which I feel like if she brought out Intermezzo as a debut novel, she would be viewed in a very different light than the fact that she brought out Normal People, for instance. And Conversation with Friends initially. But that just shows the development of her writing, the development of her focus in her characters, and definitely one of my top reads of this year as well. And I had some great reads towards the end of the year. I have to say, there's going to be a lot of these that are in the top reads. So, yeah, we'll keep talking about them. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tang. Incredible. A multi-generational storytelling of women coming from China and living in America and recreating their life here. And yet the thread of heritage and ideas that come through from mother to daughter and the mother to daughter relationships that exist in the space. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I can totally see why this book is now considered a classic. Amy Tang just nailed this. I think it's got similar multi-generational vibes like Pachinko, but obviously this is very different. And the context is very, very different. The characters are very different. The culture is incredibly different. But if you love that sort of multi-generational view of Pachinko, then you will love the Joy Luck Club. One of my favorite authors, John Williams. I then read Augustus, and what a different perspective of that historical side of, or that side of history about Augustus Caesar or Augustus Octavius Caesar. I thought it was so cleverly done. William takes the epistolatory form and turns it into something incredible, in that you are told the story of Augustus through people's interactions with each other. He is the main character, and yet he is not the main character. And the relationships that exist around him and the experiences or the plot that exists around him, with him being the focalizer but also not being the source of his own truth, is such an incredible commentary on history itself. And I think that's where Williams has this brilliance that most people overlook, because unless you understand or unless you recognize and see the profound impact of that, his work seems not superficial, but his work seems plain and ordinary and not brilliant, but it's in that non-brilliance that he excels, and he creates these wonderful, wonderful spaces to explore these concepts and make you think about them. The fact that we only get Augustus's point of view right at the end, for me, was incredible, and I loved this book so much. Would it be one of my top reads? I think it would be, because even though, and I don't star my reads, so that's not something that I do, but even though I wouldn't necessarily, if I was to star my reads, I it probably wouldn't be a 5-star read for me. It didn't have that sense of an impact. But it's still one of my top reads, because I think the way that Williams has gone about writing this is brilliant, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. So for me, yes, it would be a top read. I then read Christopher Isherwood's Goodbye to Berlin. Not my favorite read. I think it's a chaotic, I suppose, insight into the lead up to the Second World War in Berlin. And yeah, I think it's a great book. I think it's well written. I know there's parts of it that Isherwood relied on his own personal experiences for, but he has said that this is deliberately fiction. And I think the reason for that is because it paints some characters in some really poor lighting. But I think that it's important to see this kind of perspective and see this kind of writing coming out of it, and how historical events like the Second World War seem to creep in without people even noticing. So I think in that sense, it was a really, really great book. I don't know if I'm a huge fan of Ishwood's writing. I do have I think I have one of his other novels, and maybe I'll give that a go and see how I feel about it. And maybe I was just expecting a bit much from Goodbye to Berlin, but it just didn't hit home as much as I wanted it to. Interpretive Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. I anticipated that this was going to be one of my best books of 2024, and I was 100% right. Jhumpa Lahiri is an incredible writer, and this collection of short stories that she has written just was amazing. I loved reading them. A couple of my favorites that I've kept in my reading journal. A couple of my favorites were The Third and Final Continent, When Mr. Pizzada Came to Dine, but there were so many elements of the short stories that I loved, and especially I think the character of Mr. Kapasi in the Interpretive Maladies story. Really incredible. Just a wonderful book, a fascinating book, something I think is unique in short stories. I always find the short story space to be a really interesting and difficult medium to get right, because you have to create engagement in such a short space of time, and Lahiri just nails this. She is an incredible writer, and so yes, I was right. It would be one of my best books, and everyone should read this book. In a short sitting, again, because it's a small book, I read Claire Keegan's So Late in the Day. Tough book to read, in my honest opinion. It was one of those books, again, where history sits in the peripheral, but it's more subtle in this story because it's very, very honed in on one particular character and what happens to that character. And it exists, the space of the story exists within a couple of hours. And so I found that particularly fascinating as a form, and what Keegan has done to make that form so brilliant. I think it's one of those books that, because it's set in quite a contemporary day, it felt uncomfortable. And it felt uncomfortable because it's right. It's brilliant in that sense, but it felt uncomfortable because there were so many people that I knew, that I know, who maintain this view of the world today. And I think that's the brilliance of her novels, is that she makes you think about these kind of spaces, whereas small things like these in Foster exist in a historical context that seems quite detached. So Late in the Day is contemporary. It's happening now. It's happening in the space of time that we are existing in. And because of that, and because of her nuanced way of like bringing these uncomfortable bits to the forefront and making us feel them, making us acknowledge them, even when it seems that they exist on the periphery, there is that discomfort with this kind of novel. But again, that is the brilliance. And so probably not my favorite Keegan just because of that discomfort, but also probably the most visceral for me because of that discomfort. I then read Vita Nostra, which was recommended to me by one of the accepted girls, and for the life of me I cannot remember who it was that recommended this book to me, but I breezed through this book in a couple of days. It's not a short novel. I think it's something like 400 pages, but it is essentially a dark academia story if it was written by Kafka. Or actually, I think I would more accurately say this is a this is Hogwarts if, I think I said this in my TikTok, this is Hogwarts if the main character was a woman and the magic system was developed by Kafka. That is essentially what this book is about. I think there are darker elements in here than in your normal dark academia, but not for your contemporary issues like that you get in Babel, for instance, where it talks about race and colonialism. Vita Nostra is very individualistic. It is the impact of looking at the self and the self within the system, and because of that, that's why I say it's very, very individualistic. But I was hooked. I thought this book was brilliant in the way that it just draws you in and makes you a part of what's going on. As a dark academia novel, I think it hit all the right notes and definitely would introduce that sort of sense. It's not light, it's not easy, it's not always easy to understand what's going on, but I just think it's so brilliant, and I'm so sad that this novel isn't talked about more, because I think it, in terms of dark academia, this is the foundation of the canon. I think this hits so, so beautifully. And the fact that it's translated again is just something that just blows my mind. The authors, Sergei and Marina Diachenko, sorry. Sergei and Marina Diachenko are Ukrainian authors, and this book deserves so much more of a hype than what it has. I believe it was published 2007, so it is quite a bit, it's quite a year on, and maybe the reason it's not talked about is because the hype has died down about it. But I feel like this book hits so many points in the dark academia realm, and it's brilliant, and I loved it so much. The ending is bizarre, but you wouldn't expect anything less, honestly. And then the last book I read, which was last night, I started it yesterday evening, and I read it through the night. It was one of those nights. It's a tradition. I have to do it. I have to spend a night awake reading a book. And this is the book that I chose. This is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. This book crept into my soul and sat there, and it will continue to sit there for a while. I think what's engaging about this book is the dystopian aspects of it. It is set in Ireland, but it is set in a time where the government takes over control of everything, issues a state of emergency, and all of a sudden you are in this totalitarian regime, and it is terrifying for the characters. The main character, Eilish, is a mum who is looking after her children and trying to keep herself and everyone together, and it's incredible. It's incredible to see where hope becomes dangerous and where acceptance becomes life-saving. And I think it's one of those books that will definitely stay with me and definitely makes me think about the circumstances in which so many people in the world are living today, because this book echoes a reality that doesn't exist in my current sphere, but certainly exists in places like Palestine and the Gaza Strip and Ukraine. And this reality exists in so many places around the world today that it brings it to light in such an interesting manner, and it makes you feel sympathetic and empathetic. I think this is an important book. It's a prevalent book to be reading even today, even though the hype around it has maybe died down a bit since the Booker. I think it's an incredible book to read. It's very easy to read, and the plot is so engaging that it keeps you coming back for more and more and more every single time. There was a particular moment which those who have read the book will know, I believe, when your heart breaks and you see the last shred of hope leave the characters, and I don't think I'll ever get that description, that writing of that scene out of my head. It will sit there for years and years and years to come. And not that it was overtly graphic, even though it was quite graphic, but it's not. I think that's what a lot of books could take away from that, is how to create that impact, how to create that feeling in your reader without being overtly graphic, and it's that perfect balance of insinuating and showing that buries itself into your heart and will never let go. And that's exactly what Paul Lynch has done in Prophet Song. All right, that was 47 books that we spoke about in probably an hour. That's it. That's 2024's reading wrap up. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some inspiration for some books that you want to read in 2025. Do go check out my 2025 TBR video, which should be linked here. And I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for spending this huge amount of time with me, and I hope you enjoyed talking about books.